Christmas morning, snow falling, gifts under the tree, the perfect holiday, or so I thought. My sister unwrapped the biggest surprise, a brand new car. And me? I got nothing. No gift, no explanation, just silence. My parents smiled at her, beaming with pride, while I sat there, invisible. But that was just the beginning. Because what I discovered next wasn't just unfair, it was a betrayal so deep, it changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Stay till the end, because this Christmas secret? Snowflakes drifted lazily from the pale gray sky, coating everything in a soft, untouched blanket of white. The world outside seemed quiet, subdued, as if holding its breath, awaiting the unfolding of a day that promised joy but hid something darker underneath. Inside the house, the fireplace crackled and hummed, filling the room with warmth and the faint scent of pine from the decorated Christmas tree. It looked perfect, just the way it always had, year after year, when nothing could go wrong. At first glance, everything was ordinary. The house, a sprawling two-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood, gleamed with decorations, twinkling lights wrapped around the staircase banister, red and green garlands hanging from every corner. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, its lights blinking softly, and beneath it, a scattering of presents, each wrapped in pristine paper and tied with shiny ribbons. The coffee table was strewn with half-eaten pastries, mugs of hot cocoa, and half-filled glasses of spiced cider, the remnants of a morning spent in leisurely celebration. But the atmosphere in the house was not as merry as it appeared. Sitting on the couch, close to the fire, was Emily, her fingers absent-mindedly curling a strand of her long brown hair as she stared out the window. Her eyes were distant, too focused on something only she could see. Her mind wandered, though her body remained rooted in the space, a tight ball of restrained energy. She wasn't sure when the anxiety had begun to creep in. Perhaps it had been building for months, or maybe it had just hit her that morning. But today, Christmas felt different. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness, almost as if the holiday was simply another routine to get through, not the joyous celebration it had always been in her mind. Her parents, Karen and David, were in the kitchen, murmuring to one another in low voices, their backs turned as they made breakfast. Emily could hear the clink of pots and pans, the soft hum of the microwave, the laughter of her younger sister, Julia, who was bouncing around the kitchen excitedly. Julia had been the source of all the chatter that morning. She was always the spark, the one who made everything seem brighter, more alive. She was a few years younger than Emily, but it felt like she was the one who got all the attention. Maybe that was why Emily was feeling this gnawing unease. The soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Julia standing at the threshold of the living room, her face practically glowing with excitement. "Mom and Dad are ready," Julia said, grinning from ear to ear. "Come on, let's open the presents." Emily forced a smile, but the moment Julia turned her back, her expression faltered. She stood up, stretching, feeling the ache in her muscles from sitting too long. She followed her sister into the living room, where their parents were waiting, eager to unwrap the layers of holiday magic that would supposedly make everything better. Karen was perched on the edge of the armchair, watching them with a warmth that seemed genuine, her eyes bright with maternal pride. David stood by the window, hands tucked into the pockets of his sweater, his demeanor less engaged than his wife's, but still content. Emily couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the room when her father was in charge of the atmosphere. There was an air of quiet authority, a sense of power he never had to speak to, and it seemed to pull the others into place around him. "Let's start with the gifts," Karen said, her voice as light as the decorations in the room, though Emily could hear the faint tremor in it. She sat down beside her sister, trying not to let the awkwardness seep into her posture. There was something about the way the morning had been going that felt off. They hadn't had their usual routine, no silly games, no loud laughter. Emily watched as her mother handed out the first present to Julia, an eager little bundle wrapped in gold paper. Julia gasped when she saw the shape of it, eyes wide with delight. "I can't believe it," she shrieked, tearing at the wrapping paper, her joy spilling over like a river that couldn't be contained. Inside, a sleek, shiny set of keys dangled from a small velvet pouch. Julia's mouth fell open, her gaze flickering from the keys to her parents' faces. "Is this a car?" she asked, her voice hushed with disbelief. Karen beamed, her face practically glowing with pride. "Yes, sweetheart. It's all yours. A brand new car, just for you." Emily's heart stuttered in her chest. The room seemed to freeze, the festive chatter suddenly muffled by the roaring in her ears. A car? Julia was getting a car? The air thickened around her. The sudden sharpness of the moment took her by surprise, and for a moment, she felt as if the ground beneath her was slipping away. A car? The thought raced through her mind, her heart pounding. She felt it before the anger started to creep in, bitter, icy, all-consuming. They'd always promised that the holiday season was about everyone, that it wasn't about the gifts, but this? This was different. David turned slowly from the window, his face creased into a soft smile, as if this moment were part of some well-practiced ritual. "We thought you'd like something special this year," he said, his words so casual, so rehearsed. Julia jumped up, squealing with excitement, hugging their parents. "Thank you. Thank you so much." The tension in Emily's chest only deepened. She sat back, her gaze fixed on the unwrapped gift in her sister's hands. The room swirled around her, a blur of voices and laughter that felt so far away. She swallowed hard, trying to shove the sour taste from her mouth, but it wouldn't leave. Karen and David exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding between them that Emily could not ignore. There was a glint of satisfaction in their eyes, but it was something deeper, something colder. The moment lingered, suspended in time, before Emily's mother turned her gaze toward her. "Emily, sweetheart." Karen's voice pulled Emily from her thoughts, but it was too late. The words that followed felt rehearsed, distant, like they weren't meant for her at all. We didn't get you anything this year. We're sorry. But we wanted to surprise Julia with this special gift." Emily's stomach churned. The bitterness rose again, and she forced herself to smile, though it felt like a mask, a thin veil over the crack in her heart. "It's fine," she said, the words flat, almost robotic. "I'm happy for her." But deep down, her chest tightened in a way she couldn't explain. Something inside her was breaking, quietly, piece by piece. David stepped forward, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, but his touch felt foreign, like a stone pressing into her skin. "You understand, don't you, Emily? You're old enough now, and, well, we figured you wouldn't need something like this." Her mind raced, unable to fully process the weight of his words. "You're old enough now." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words were stuck, lost somewhere deep in her throat. She looked at her sister, at her mother, and finally at her father. The family she thought she knew was slipping through her fingers, and with it, the truth, hidden behind the glossy wrapping paper and festive bows, was becoming clearer. She was invisible to them, but that was nothing compared to the betrayal waiting just around the corner. The days following Christmas were a strange blur for Emily. The dissonance between what had been said and what she had felt lingered in her chest, a dull ache that refused to subside. Every conversation, every glance between her parents and Julia, carried a weight she couldn't escape. The quiet, unspoken dynamic was like a low hum, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. They didn't say it outright, but it was there, the unspoken truth that her parents had chosen Julia, given her the spotlight, and left Emily with nothing but the hollow shell of their expectations. She tried to push it away. After all, it was just a car. A shiny, expensive toy to celebrate a holiday. She could have been better than this, could have risen above. But she wasn't. The jealousy festered, quiet at first, but slowly poisoning her every interaction. Julia, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, flitted through their shared moments with the grace of a child who had just been handed the world. She was on top of the world, showing off her new car like it was the crown jewel of her life, and their parents, especially their mother, practically worshipped her for it. There were the compliments, the gestures of pride, the way Karen looked at her youngest daughter with such glowing eyes, a look that made Emily feel as if she were an afterthought. Even their father, normally so removed, had been strangely affectionate with Julia. He hadn't smiled at Emily like that in years, if ever. His attention toward Julia was marked by an almost possessive pride, an energy that seemed to suck the life out of the room whenever he directed it at her. Emily had noticed, but couldn't bring herself to call it out. She was too afraid of what the truth might mean. That was the thing about manipulation, it didn't happen all at once. It slithered into the spaces where people thought they were safe, where they believed they knew the rules. And her parents had been masters of it, weaving their own subtle game of control. As the week wore on, Emily found herself avoiding family meals. The tension, thick in the air, was palpable. She didn't want to sit across from her sister, grinning from ear to ear, talking about her car and all the places she would go. Julia, despite her best efforts, didn't understand why Emily wasn't as thrilled as she was. It was during one of these meals that the quiet resentment finally boiled over. "Emily, could you pass the potatoes?" Julia asked, her voice light, innocent. Her tone was soft, but there was a sharp edge to her question that Emily couldn't ignore. It was as if Julia was daring her to respond in any other way than the one expected, to be grateful, to not make a scene. The moment hung in the air, thick with the tension that had been building for days. Emily's hand hovered over the serving dish, and she could feel the weight of the gaze that followed her every movement, the attention that she could no longer avoid. "You know," Julia continued, oblivious, "I'm really excited to drive the car to school next week. It's going to be so much fun. I can't believe it's really mine." She beamed, completely unaware of the storm she was stirring. Emily's grip tightened on the dish, her knuckles pale. She couldn't speak. She had to bite back the words that wanted to pour out. The jealousy, the betrayal, it swirled inside her like a dangerous storm. Each breath she took felt heavier than the last. David, sitting at the head of the table, cleared his throat, as if sensing the strain in the room. But instead of easing the tension, his voice only deepened it. "Julia's right. That car's a great step. You know, I was considering giving Emily a car once she got her license, but," he glanced over at Emily, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if appraising her in a way that made her skin crawl. "But we both know she's not quite there yet. Maybe next year, huh?" The words hit her like a slap. The casual dismissal, the way he placed Julia on a pedestal, making it clear, without saying it outright, that Emily wasn't quite good enough to deserve the same. It was always about Julia, wasn't it? Before she could even process her emotions, Emily stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor in an unceremonious protest. She didn't trust herself to stay calm. "I think I'll go upstairs," she muttered, her voice flat, hollow. She couldn't bear to sit there, to pretend this wasn't cutting her deep. The room fell silent. She could feel their eyes on her as she left, but she couldn't meet them. She couldn't look at her father's cold expression or her mother's worried gaze. It wasn't about the car anymore, it was about everything that had been left unsaid for years. Upstairs in her room, Emily paced back and forth, trying to catch her breath. Her heart raced, a storm of frustration crashing against the walls of her chest. But it wasn't just jealousy that was burning inside her, it was something darker. Something more dangerous. She had never felt like this before. It was as if the foundation she had built her entire life on was cracking beneath her feet, and she didn't know how to stop it. The resentment that had been there, simmering quietly for so long, now bubbled to the surface in a way that terrified her. What was she supposed to do with all this anger? This feeling of being left behind? Of being invisible? Minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Her mother's voice came through the wood, soft but insistent. "Emily?" Karen called. "Can I come in?" Reluctantly, Emily opened the door. Her mother stood there, her face a mask of concern. There was always concern, but never understanding. Never the recognition that Emily had been overlooked, forgotten. "Sweetheart, what's wrong? You've been so quiet since Christmas." "It's not like you." Emily couldn't keep the bitterness from creeping into her voice. "It's fine," she muttered, stepping away from the door, her arms folding protectively across her chest. I don't want to talk about it." "Emily," Karen said, her voice firm but still laced with that maternal sweetness. "You know you can always come to me. If something's bothering you, I'm fine, Mom," Emily snapped, a little too sharply. She winced at the tone in her voice but couldn't take it back. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for a long time. For a moment, Karen just stood there, her lips pressed tight, eyes searching Emily's face as if trying to decode her. But then, as if she had come to some conclusion, her face softened. "Look, I know things have been a little different lately," she said, stepping into the room. "But we're just trying to do what's best for everyone. You know that, right?" Emily's pulse quickened, her throat tightening. It was the same line. Always the same line. I know, Mom, she said, her voice thin, strained. I just don't think I fit in here anymore. The words spilled out before she could stop them. It was too late to take them back. Her mother's face hardened for just a second, and for a brief moment, Emily saw the exhaustion in her eyes. It was a look she had seen before, a look that said not now. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the words she was about to say seemed to die before they left her lips. Instead, she stepped forward, pulling Emily into a hug. I love you, sweetheart. Don't ever forget that. But Emily couldn't feel it. The hug was hollow, the words empty. The disconnection between them, between everyone, had grown so vast, so wide, that it was almost impossible to bridge. When her mother left, Emily sat on her bed, staring out the window at the empty street. The snow had stopped falling, but the weight of everything, the lies, the manipulation, the jealousy, pressed down on her like a 1,000-ton weight. Everything was changing, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to survive it. But one thing was clear. The truth was beginning to surface, and when it did, it would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. The day the truth came crashing down felt like any other, until it didn't. It was a late afternoon, the sky a bruised purple-gray as the last light of the day bled out of the windows. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after something has been broken and no one wants to address it. The tension between Emily and her family had been building for days, weeks, maybe. The cracks were too deep to ignore now. She could feel it in the air every time she walked into a room, like the walls themselves were closing in on her. She couldn't stay silent anymore. The truth had become an unbearable weight. It started with a phone call, unexpected and unwelcome. Emily had been pacing again, as she often did these days, trying to wear out the anxiety in her chest, trying to make sense of the chaos inside her. The ring of the house phone cut through the quiet. Her mother was out, and her father was in the basement. It was just her and Julia, who was sitting on the couch with her phone, her face buried in whatever text thread or Instagram post had captured her attention. Emily stood still for a moment, the phone's ringing vibrating through her. She felt her heart rate spike, a sharp pulse of unease. Something about the call made her feel like it was something she couldn't ignore. Her instinct screamed at her, telling her to pick it up, to answer it, but it was like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing what would happen if she jumped, and yet feeling compelled to do it anyway. When the answering machine kicked in, Emily rushed forward and snatched the receiver from its cradle. Hello? It was her father's voice on the other end. Emily, David said, his tone clipped, too measured. It didn't sound like her father at all. I need you to come downstairs. There was something in his voice, something that set off a spark of alarm in Emily's gut. It wasn't a request, it was a command. What's going on? She asked, her pulse quickening. It's about Julia, he said, his voice tight, strained. Just come downstairs. Without another word, he hung up. Emily's mind raced. What had happened? Was Julia okay? She didn't stop to think, just bolted for the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she hurried down to the basement. Each step brought her closer to whatever nightmare was waiting for her, and the closer she got, the more she could feel the knot in her stomach tightening, choking her. When she reached the door to the basement, her hand froze on the handle. A flash of doubt rippled through her mind. What if I'm imagining things? What if her father was just? No. There was no denying it now. Something was wrong. She opened the door, stepping into the dim light. Her father was sitting at the table, his back to her, but he didn't even turn when she walked in. Julia wasn't there, Dad? Emily's voice cracked as she spoke, the air thick with tension. Sit down, he said, his voice colder now, almost mechanical. She did as told, sitting across from him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The basement was still, the only sound the faint hum of the old furnace in the corner. Emily's mind raced, every possible scenario running through her head. Had something happened to Julia? Was she hurt? David finally turned to face her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. You should know, he started slowly, deliberately, as if forcing the words out of his mouth was the hardest thing he'd ever done. I've been thinking a lot lately. About things. About family. Emily felt a chill ripple down her spine. She didn't know why, but suddenly, she didn't want to hear this conversation. She couldn't bring herself to look him in the eyes. Julia's getting that car, David continued, and Emily felt her heart drop into her stomach. You're upset about it. You've been acting out. I'm not upset. Emily cut him off, but even to herself, she knew the lie was thin, fragile. Her fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into the palm of her hand. I just don't understand why. Why Julia always gets everything. She's not better than me. The words poured out before she could stop them. The floodgates had opened. David didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on her, calculating, like he was waiting for something. His face, normally so impassive, was etched with an emotion she couldn't quite place, he said after a moment, his voice low and controlled. But I think it's time you knew something. Something twisted in Emily's gut. Julia isn't the only one who deserves special treatment, he continued, leaning forward. His words dripped with a quiet venom, something sharp and dangerous. You don't understand how much she's had to put up with. You never do. The weight of the words hit Emily like a slap across the face. Her mind reeled. What are you talking about? David's eyes flickered, and for a split second, she saw a flicker of something, guilt? Regret? But it vanished almost immediately, replaced by something darker. Emily, he said, his voice soft but chilling. It was always going to be her, not you. Julia was meant for this. You were just a mistake. The words settled around Emily like a heavy fog. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. Everything, the entire foundation of her family, had just crumbled in one devastating sentence. A mistake. She sat frozen, her skin turning cold, her blood turning to ice. Her father had just told her, in the cruelest way possible, that everything she had been, everything she thought she was nothing. Tears stung at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She refused to let him see how deeply he had cut her. David leaned back, as if satisfied, as if he had just laid out some great truth, and he expected her to understand. I never meant to hurt you, he said quietly, as if he could erase the ugliness of what he had just said. But you were never the one we hoped for. You weren't the daughter we needed. Emily stood up abruptly, her heart racing, her legs trembling. She wanted to scream, to yell at him, to throw something, anything, but she couldn't move. She felt as if the air around her had turned to stone. Go upstairs, Emily. We'll talk later, David said, his tone dismissive, as if the conversation was already over. But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Is Julia part of this? She asked, her voice hoarse, the words scraping her throat. Does she know? David didn't even flinch. He only nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. She knows everything. She always has. Emily's world shattered. The betrayal stung more than anything she could have imagined. All these years, all the moments where she thought she was doing something right, had been nothing more than a lie. She wasn't the daughter they wanted. She wasn't the one they had ever truly cared about. In that moment, all the rage she had been suppressing exploded inside her. Her heart thumped so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. She turned, her feet heavy as she stormed up the stairs, not caring if she made noise. She had to get out of that house. Had to escape, but when she reached the living room, she stopped. Julia was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with confusion, but there was something else there. A glint of satisfaction? Emily's heart stopped, her blood turning cold. Her sister was looking at her with pity, but not the kind that felt comforting. It was the kind of pity you'd give someone you've already beaten. You should have known, Julia said softly, the words dripping with something cruel. Emily's body trembled with the realization. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in her life, Emily understood that her sister, her own flesh and blood, had known exactly what was happening all along. The betrayal was complete and the true devastation was yet to come. The days after the confrontation were a blur of numbness. Emily moved through them as though in a fog, each day stretching on, each minute dragging her deeper into the dark hole where the betrayal had left her. Her mind couldn't reconcile what had happened, what her father had said, what Julia had revealed. It was like everything she had known to be true had been torn away, leaving her standing in a vast, empty space where nothing made sense. Her parents barely spoke to her. The silence between them was deafening. as if they were too ashamed to face what had just been uncovered. Karen still tried to act as though nothing had changed, but her forced smiles and the awkward way she cleared her throat whenever they crossed paths made Emily want to scream. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, had chosen to side with Julia. Emily could feel it in the way Karen moved around her, in the way her eyes seemed to constantly dart away, unable to hold her gaze for more than a few seconds. It was the unspoken truth of it that stung the worst. Julia, too, had retreated into herself, her presence now almost like a shadow that followed Emily everywhere. The two sisters, once so close, now moved like strangers in the same house. Julia no longer had that sweet, innocent tone that used to irritate Emily so much. Now, it felt like a weapon, carefully honed, a reminder of the way she had played everyone around her, including Emily herself. But the hardest part wasn't the silence. It wasn't the cold treatment from her family. It was the crushing realization that she had been nothing but a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Emily had spent her entire life trying to prove her worth to people who never cared to see her, while Julia had been living in the shadow of a reality that Emily hadn't even been aware existed. It had all been a lie. Emily spent most of her time in her room now, staring out the window at the world that seemed to go on as if nothing had happened. The cold winter sky was just as indifferent to her pain as the rest of the world seemed to be. Her friends had stopped calling, her social life dissolved in the wake of everything that had been revealed. It wasn't like she could go to them for comfort, anyway. How could she explain to them that her family had never loved her the way they loved Julia? How could she put into words that the sister she had trusted had been complicit in the lie for years? One evening, after another long day of silence, Emily finally gathered the strength to confront her mother. She couldn't stay in this house, drowning in the lies. She had to speak up, had to make her mother understand how deeply she had been hurt. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse and trembling as she approached Karen in the kitchen, who was quietly stirring a pot on the stove. Karen didn't look up. The hum of the stove was the only sound between them. "I don't know what to say to you, Emily," Karen said softly, her back still turned. "What do you want me to say? You already know everything. Your father, he's just," she trailed off, her words dying in the air. Emily's heart clenched at the dismissal in her mother's tone. She could hear the distance that had crept in, how Karen's voice had become hollow, like she was speaking to a stranger. "You don't get it," Emily said, stepping forward. "I don't care about the stupid car. I care that you chose her over me. You always chose her over me." There was a long pause before Karen finally turned to face her. Her expression was tired, worn. Her eyes, so often full of that maternal warmth, now looked like they had seen too much. "You think I wanted any of this?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want any of this to happen." "But you did," Emily shot back, her voice growing louder. "You let it happen. You and Dad, you made sure that I knew where I stood. It was always about Julia, wasn't it? And I was just there, as a backup." The words were raw now, coming from a place so deep within her that she couldn't stop them if she tried. Her mother's face crumpled. "That's not how I meant it, Emily. You're both my daughters." "But Julia," Karen faltered. "She needed us. You don't understand, but she was always in need of more. She needed constant validation. I couldn't let her slip through the cracks like you did. And I thought if I gave her that, maybe she'd stop falling apart." Emily stood there, stunned by the confession. Her mother had never once looked at her the way she had looked at Julia. Emily had always been the strong one, the one who could fend for herself. It wasn't a choice, it was just how she had been. Julia had always been the fragile one, needing constant care, constant attention. And her parents had fed into that, at Emily's expense. "You don't even see it," Emily whispered. "You never saw me." "Not really." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but Emily didn't wait for her to finish. She turned and walked out of the room, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Her family had turned their backs on her. She had given them everything, her loyalty, her trust, and in return, they had destroyed her. She could feel it now, the devastation of it all settling deep in her bones. The days that followed were filled with a kind of numbness. Emily went through the motions, but her heart wasn't in anything anymore. Her room became her sanctuary, the place where she could retreat and pretend that she wasn't drowning in a sea of pain. Her mother's attempts at reconciliation were weak at best, her father's presence more of a distant memory than anything real. Julia, however, kept trying to reach out to her, pity in her voice, guilt in her eyes, but Emily refused to let her in. There was nothing left to say, but it didn't end there. The ripples from the shattered foundation of their family began to spread, finding their way into the outside world. Friends of her parents began to ask questions. Whispers circulated through the local community, and Emily felt like everyone knew her deepest shame before she could even say the words. The cracks in her family were no longer confined to the walls of their home, they had bled out, poisoned everything. It wasn't just the people who had known her family who noticed the change. The pressure began to weigh on Karen and David to pretend everything was fine. They couldn't look their friends in the eye, couldn't sit through dinner parties with forced smiles. Everyone saw through the facade, saw that the family wasn't what it appeared to be. For Emily, the emotional toll was unbearable. She had lost the one thing she had thought would always be there, her family. What good was it to be surrounded by people who claimed to love you but never really saw you? What was left when all the layers of illusion had been stripped away? In the end, Emily came to a conclusion, though it wasn't one that she had ever expected to make. She had to leave. For her own sanity, for her own sense of self-worth, she had to walk away from the people who had betrayed her. It wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about survival, and as she stood on the threshold of that house, the house that had once felt like home but now felt like a prison, she realized that the betrayal wasn't just a single event. It was the culmination of years of neglect, of manipulation, of being invisible in a family that was supposed to love her, but she wasn't invisible anymore. And that was the first step toward finding herself again. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, Emily didn't feel the need to hide. She was done running. Months passed after Emily left the house that had been both a home and a prison, and in that time, she came to understand the weight of what had happened. The betrayal, the lies, it was all still fresh, but with each passing day, the sting dulled slightly. She found herself becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who no longer felt the need to define herself by the people who had failed her. She had to leave in order to find herself, to piece together the broken parts of her identity that had been cracked wide open by the people she had loved most. Her new life wasn't perfect. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when she could still hear the echoes of the silence in her family home. But she was learning how to silence those echoes, to drown out the voices of her past. She had started working at a local cafe, a simple job, but it gave her purpose. She made new friends, people who saw her for who she was, not as a shadow of someone else. And with time, she began to feel the small flickers of joy that had once felt impossible. For the first time in years, Emily was taking control of her life, no longer at the mercy of a family that had never truly seen her. As for her family, the fallout continued. David and Karen, consumed by the guilt of what they had done, drifted apart. The cracks in their marriage, which had always been there, grew wider. They no longer knew how to speak to each other without bitterness tainting their words. Julia, too, seemed to carry her own burden. She had tried reaching out to Emily a few times, but Emily had never responded. It wasn't that she wanted to hurt Julia, it was simply that she couldn't allow herself to be dragged back into that world, not until she was sure she had healed. And maybe, deep down, Emily didn't believe that Julia could ever truly understand the pain she had caused. Julia had always been the center of their universe, and Emily had been the one who had to stand in the shadows. Months later, Emily received an unexpected letter from her father. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was a clumsy attempt at an explanation, one that spoke of regret but failed to acknowledge the depth of the hurt he had caused. It was clear that he didn't fully grasp the damage, didn't truly understand how his favoritism had shaped her entire existence. But there was something in the letter that made Emily pause, a small, almost imperceptible plea for reconciliation. He wrote about how much he missed her, how he wished they could fix things. But the letter felt hollow. It wasn't the apology she had longed for, it was a desperate attempt to claw back into her life, Without the understanding of what needed to be fixed, she held on to the letter for days, staring at it but unsure what to do with it. She thought about throwing it away, burning it, anything to erase the lingering ties to a past that had been so painful. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the hope that one day, when they had all healed, they could sit down and have an honest conversation. Maybe it was the faint possibility that they could find some form of closure. Emily didn't know if that would ever come, but she wasn't ready to shut the door entirely. Not yet. In the meantime, she focused on moving forward. She had to, for her own sanity. She realized that while the past had shaped her, it didn't define her. She was no longer the girl who had been overlooked, the girl who had never been enough. She had proved to herself that she was worthy of love and respect, not because of anything her family had given her, but because of who she was. Her worth had never been tied to their approval. As the seasons changed and the world kept turning, Emily grew more sure of her place in it. She made decisions for herself now, not out of fear or obligation, but because she knew she deserved happiness. She wasn't going to allow herself to be consumed by the past, by the anger or betrayal. She had her own life to live, and she intended to live it on her own terms. Julia, on the other hand, wasn't faring quite as well. Though she never publicly admitted it, those who knew her well could see the cracks in her perfect facade. She had become a shell of the person she once was, her confidence eroded by the guilt of what had happened. The power she had once wielded, the manipulations she had so carefully orchestrated, now left her feeling hollow. She had everything she had ever wanted, her parents' adoration, the car, the attention, but it wasn't enough. It could never be enough, because Emily had been right. She had never truly earned it. One evening, not long after receiving her father's letter, Emily ran into Julia at a local coffee shop. It was an awkward moment, both of them frozen in place as they saw each other for the first time in months. There was a tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but neither of them spoke at first. Julia seemed to shrink, like a petal wilting under the weight of the truth. "I'm sorry," Julia said finally, her voice small, barely above a whisper. Emily blinked, taken aback. She wasn't expecting an apology, at least not this one, not from someone who had always believed herself to be in control. "For everything," Julia continued, the words stumbling out as if they were foreign to her. "I was selfish. I didn't see you. I didn't see how much I hurt you." Emily said nothing at first, but in the silence between them, she realized something profound. Julia's apology was incomplete. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, not really. She was asking for a chance to make things right, even if that meant acknowledging how badly she had failed. And while Emily wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive her sister, she did realize that this moment was something she had longed for, a chance to hear the words she never thought would come. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emily replied honestly, her voice calm but firm. "But I appreciate you saying that." Julia nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they shared a quiet, understanding look. They were two broken people, shaped by the same family, yet each of them carrying their own scars. There was no easy resolution, no perfect moment of reconciliation. But in that shared silence, Emily realized that maybe that was okay. Healing didn't come in grand gestures. It came in small steps. As for their parents, time did little to heal their wounds. David and Karen's marriage eventually crumbled under the weight of their failures. They parted ways, though there was no real animosity between them, only the slow, painful understanding that they had both contributed to the ruin of their family. They had raised 2 daughters, but somewhere along the way, they had forgotten to love them equally. The events that had unfolded, Julia's manipulation, the betrayal, the silence, spoke to the fragile nature of trust and the power of unspoken expectations. Family, Emily realized, was both the most comforting and the most dangerous thing. It had the power to build, but it also had the power to destroy. In the end, it wasn't about what her parents had given her, or what Julia had taken. It was about learning to stand on her own, to find her own path when the people she thought she could trust had turned their backs, and so, Emily kept moving forward. Not in a straight line, not without pain, but with the knowledge that she had survived. She had learned that the most important thing was not the love of others, but the love of oneself.